let me introduce Owen Levy to you, who is our special guest tonight. Owen Levy will read to us from his latest novel, Goodbye Heiko, Goodbye Berlin, set in large parts in Berlin while the city was still divided and after unification. The novel is touching on a lot of topics, recent German history, and in some parts also not so recent German history, the situation of the gay community in Berlin.
And East Berlin as well.
In both parts of Berlin, and well, the LGBT community in general in recent decades, the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa. So probably you will get a good insight by what Owen is going to read to you. Owen Levy has a long-lasting career in public relations. In the mid-1980s, he worked on a documentary about African American performers working in Germany. Owen had extended stays in Berlin covering film and music scenes for US trade publications. He contributed he was involved in the Berlin Film Festival, among a lot of other things. And Owen Levy is very well known for his first novel, called A Brother's Touch, which came out in 1982 and made quite a splash, was quite controversial at the time, and is still in print today, a book about the difficulties of gay life and the misery of drug addiction in New York City some, let's say, 40 years ago?
In the 70s.
In the 70s. So I hope now that we will have an interesting evening with, first the reading from parts of the book, and then there will be time for questions and answers also afterwards. So please enjoy, and then there will be some food and some drinks afterwards. Thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming here tonight, and I appreciate this opportunity to discuss and read from my novel, Goodbye Heiko, Goodbye Berlin, and of course I decided with that title because of Christopher Isherwood used his goodbye story, so I figured, let's keep that because that's a reference in that regard. And besides the novel, I also want to share with you some of the unique history I witnessed from a ringside seat on the Berlin Wall, so to speak, though later that was possible in the nearly 2 decades that I lived in Berlin. The idea of spending time abroad, specifically in Europe, had been a goal of mine since I was a teenager. I was much impressed with the expatriate American writers who lived in France, James Baldwin, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, the Fitzgeralds, and Richard Wright, and then in England, T.S. Eliot and Sylvia Plath, and in Italy, Tennessee Williams, Gore Vidal, and Ezra Pound. These are all Americans expatriates, writers who live in Europe, and so this is the kind of thing that I was very conscious of because one of my neighbors was the American poet Marianne Moore, and most of these writers were her friends. So they would be in the neighborhood. I didn't always meet them, but she would tell me who'd been around, that sort of thing. After several weeks of traveling in Europe, the summer before my senior year of college, it renewed my interest in coming back to Europe to live. And I thought after I graduated that I'd be coming back, but life isn't like that. I got involved in a lot of different things. I went to San Francisco, at the height of Haight-Ashbury, that sort of thing. And so finally, after the publication of my first novel, I got the opportunity, a chance because of financial security. I was able to decide, well, this is the time for me to go to Europe if I'm going to do it. And so I had originally thought I was going to live in Amsterdam because Amsterdam had made such a great impression on me during my first trip to Europe. But in Amsterdam, I kind of found things sort of narrow. The streets were small, and the bicycles were on the sidewalks, and you had to always listen for the cling cling, to get out of the way. And So at this pension I was staying, I met an American who had just come from Berlin. And he said, well, you must go to Berlin. He said, you've got to go check Berlin out. I said, well, yeah. He said to me, you know that Hitler had destroyed all the housing to make the streets wide. So he said, you won't have that problem of traffic riding the sidewalks because the streets are all bright. They're all nice and wide. In my initial visit to Berlin, I was immediately drawn to this vibrant, multicultural city surrounded by an ominous wall, an unfortunate throwback to medieval times. Then I eventually discovered that the wall's presence was not something that was a part of everyday, people's consciousness. They could ignore it. It was there, and sometimes it was an inconvenience. But, living in the city, we were not walled in. You really felt that you were in a free society. It was open. It was only when someone from East Germany breached the wall in a desperate bid to escape to the West for political freedom that the cold reality of division made itself dramatically apparent, especially when so many never made it and died very cruelly trying in the no man's land between the two sections of the wall. Young West Germans could beat the military draft by living in West Berlin. International performers and artists of every stripe found reasonable studio spaces, and a way that they could improve their craft by living in the city. And scholars from all over the world either went to the university or to some of the think tanks. So this environment, this conversion of all these different kind of people made the city, gave it a unique creative energy. And let's not forget the sassy natives, the born Berliners, who need no help in making life in their island paradise memorable. There's that Berlin character, that sort of smart Berlin. Little did I know on that first warm October evening when I arrived in West Berlin at the main train station, Bahnhof Zoological Garten, or Bahnhof Zoo, that I would be spending nearly the next 2 decades in Berlin, and it would become sort of my second hometown, as it were, and eventually the inspiration for this novel, which I'm going to be reading excerpts to you from tonight. My tale begins with the first-person narrator who thinks he's seen a long-lost pal in a crowded Berlin street. Ruminations. How reliable is memory? Is what is remembered really what happened? With the passing of time comes embellishment and omission. Is what we see or think we see a reliable record? A recent incident precipitated a wistful glance back. My first thought was, I've seen a ghost. Had I? I strained to get a better look. It is he. I was almost certain. Then again, maybe not. Blame it on optical fulfillment, conjuring up what I want to see based on vague semblances, broad sloping shoulders, windswept locks of golden hair, the distinctive stride of his don't give a damn swagger that drew me to him in the first place. It just could be possible, I kept telling myself. It just could be him. But what if it wasn't? No big deal. I have been mistaken before. Still, I had to be sure. Sure that my maturing eyes were playing tricks, and it was not at all whom I thought it was. Then again, what if it was? What if Heiko Heinz was back in Berlin? The prospect made me giddy. My first exposure to the reality of a divided Germany was taking the day train from Amsterdam. All ground transportation at this time passing over the borders of the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, as East Germany was officially designated, was strictly controlled. Travelers were issued transit visas when traveling from the West German border through East German territory and surrendered just before crossing the border into West Berlin. Ah, Berlin, a legendary metropolis and one-time capital of previous German regimes, was chopped up by the Allies after the war as spoils of war. It was the last outpost of the free world, an inland stronghold amidst a sea of red, and one of the most visible symbols of the Cold War, that chilly period when Soviet and American influences were at odds and kept the world on edge with the threat of nuclear annihilation. The border crossing experience was one way East Germany flexed its muscle and picked up hard currency. Travel through the border was an elaborate ritual, and one that could sometimes be nerve-wracking for those of us seeking visas for a visit. Seduction. Checkpoint Charlie is the most celebrated of two crossing points open for transiting foreign nationals who want to visit East Berlin. The first thing I noticed approaching the border on the Allied side was a prominently positioned sign translated to 4 languages: English, French, Russian, and German, warning ominously, "You are now leaving the American sector." Beyond the multilingual warning loomed the forbidding barrier. Constructed of stark gray cinder block, topped with metal spikes and grids of barbed wire, it was intentionally ugly and inhospitable. Monitoring traffic on the Allied side were wholesome-looking American soldiers, smartly uniformed in crisp fatigues, white safety helmets, and red armbands emblazoned with MP, military police. Fresh-faced and disarmingly earnest, many were barely out of adolescence. Groups of Asian tourists paused to pose and snap photos of one another using the wholesome GIs and the looming wall behind as a backdrop. On a nearby corner, what looked from their dark, somber dress to be a group of East European dissidents or refugees milled around restlessly, chain-smoking, looking expectant and anxious. Were they planning some kind of demonstration? I couldn't help thinking how familiar the whole setting was from post-war spy and cinematic fiction. It was hard not to imagine the rogues gallery of facile sleuths and crafty villains, real and conjured, that had passed back and forth through the years. I started seeing the assembled cast of characters in a very melodramatic light. The beaming GIs waved me across the Allied section, no questions asked. Maneuvering around cars lined up waiting to cross, I found the pedestrian walkway that made my way to the East German customs shed, for in truth it was no more than that, to secure the mandatory visa for travel. The hall was crowded and not terribly well lit. The lines were long and the decor not especially visitor-friendly. Signs clearly designated who was to wait in which queue: West Germans, citizens of the European Union, and foreigners, or Ausländer, like me. There was no seating. You stood no matter how long it took. A cluster of East German border guards entered the hall, conspicuously armed with automatic long guns slung over their shoulders, no doubt of Soviet origin. The drab green uniforms, imposing display of firepower, and rigid, unforgiving demeanor made their intentions clear. They were in the business of intimidation. Upon closer inspection, they were fairly young like their American counterparts, raw recruits, barely out of basic training. Yet these soldiers carried themselves with palpable insolence, sinister reminders of the totalitarian authority they embodied. The deadly earnestness of their rigid deportment made me uneasy. I was not alone. There was guarded wariness in faces of all those around me waiting for the visas. My protagonist now gets through this intimidating customs procedure, but not before he's obligated to pay for the visa and exchange a certain amount of West German marks for East German money. At the time, East German money had no free market value, so obtaining hard currency from the West helped the East German economy, or bolstered the East German economy. Leaving East German customs and finally stepping outside of the narrator discovers a strange and unfamiliar world. It is in sharp contrast to consumer-oriented West Berlin, where as an American, one could feel right at home, because fast food chains like McDonald's and Burger King and other familiar American and international brands are highly conspicuous. Seduction. The eastern side of the infamous checkpoint left one in a relatively desolate part of town. Down long, narrow, treeless streets, few pedestrians were visible. The squat but massive Prussian-era buildings loomed like staid old Teutonic shamans, austere and vaguely forbidding. Later, I discovered desolation was true of streets with any proximity to the wall. Any sort of activity too close to the sacred barricade was discouraged. Buildings with the misfortune to be located along streets where the wall was erected now stood derelict, many sealed shut, often whole blocks demolished so as not to be used as cover for escape attempts. Left standing, there was just too much temptation to try, despite the deadly buffer zone of spikes and landmines running between the barrier's dual walls. Once I got closer to the city center, approaching the celebrated Boulevard Unter den Linden, pedestrian and vehicle traffic picked up considerably, and it felt more like a downtown. It was immediately apparent that this side of town bore traces of older, grander times, much of the architecture monumental, if clearly neglected. Crumbling, bullet-ridden facades were stark reminders of the pitched battles that took place on these streets in the closing days of World War II as Russians and then Americans captured the city. I promptly noticed the absence of commercial advertising. No colorful billboards on the sides of buses or gigantic electric signs enticing consumers with flashy slogans and seductive product depictions. The visual dullness of the landscape made it hard to ignore the aesthetic eyesores the socialist state constructed in the 1950s and 60s. Nondescript housing blocks and office towers fabricated of unadorned brick or metal alloys in numbing utilitarian blandness. Above the hum of traffic, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. There was little interaction among pedestrians walking past or waiting at tram stops. No spontaneous laughter or loud conversations. The motor traffic was sparse also and came in waves. Compact trabans, or trabbies, as the beloved East German automobiles are affectionately called, rumbled by in intermittent packs, spewing noxious fumes, sputtering and choking. The car interiors looked cramped, and the chassis moved awkwardly, like box crates strapped to four wheels, seemingly lacking any true sense of autodynamics. A sprinkling of other makes, mostly Eastern European bloc and Soviet-made, shared the roadways, but trabbies by far outnumbered. Even so, they were dwarfed by the grand boulevard they bounced along. It's on this maiden voyage to East Berlin that my narrator meets Heiko Heinz in one of the coffee bars located around Alexanderplatz, a legendary transit and shopping plaza. They became Schnellkumpels, or fast friends, and the narrator soon becomes Heiko's best Wessie, the friend who on regular trips to East Berlin comes laden with sacks of edible treats and fashions unattainable by regular citizens in East Germany. And like so many before him, Heiko eventually confides to his American friend he wants out. Flight interruptus. Defecting was the only solution, he announced soberly. Part of me was thrilled. An escape attempt showed courage, that he was willing to gamble what little freedom he had on a daring chance for more. At the same time, I was concerned about the consequences of failure. When he got around to laying out his plans, I had no idea I was going to play a role. Still enrolled at the university, he applied for a student travel visa to visit Prague. So, with nothing nefarious suspected, official permission was granted. From Prague, he would take a bus to Budapest, then a cab to a village near the border, and in the night slip across the border into Austria. At least, that's how he explained it to me. I wondered aloud how he had raised money to cover the trip. I've been helping Natasha's mom, he had casually admitted. I'm good with scissors. Why shouldn't I take advantage? Maybe I cut your hair sometime. Actually, it would be a good practice to work on hair with your texture. I'll do whatever it takes to help, I offered gamely and inadvertently set myself up. You will? He asked. Now he got around to mentioning what had clearly been on his mind from the start. He needed some help. What kind of help? I asked tentatively. Some papers. I need to have copies made. No big deal. What kind of papers? He showed me some official-looking paperwork. Like, I need perfect reproductions produced on high-end color copiers. Like printing presses before them, access to photocopy equipment in a totalitarian state like East Germany was strictly controlled. The free flow of information threatened party sovereignty. The quality of the East Bloc equipment that might be secretly available was no match for the latest in Western technology. He handed me the documents. 2 were completed visa forms with stamps, seals that were actually pieces of art. The 3rd was a page from a passport, subtly altered. I expressed my confusion. I thought you got official permission, I reminded him. Yes, for Czechoslovakia, but I need documents to get into Hungary. I fell silent. He sensed my unease. He assured me he would never give away anyone who helped him if, horrors of horrors, he didn't make it. But if you're really uncomfortable, I'll have to find another way. The last thing I wanted was to be a source of disappointment. I was glad he had not stooped to saying something like, when I get to the West, we'll be able to spend more time together. No, he hadn't got cheesy on me by implying some sort of shared future. I appreciated that. It made him all the more attractive. What he wanted wasn't very difficult, just a little risky. Yes, I agreed, perhaps a bit too easily. How big a crime was taking some papers back and forth? I had never undergone any kind of search at border crossings. There was no reason to think it might change. As an aside to this, I did smuggle out a novel manuscript by a Jewish woman writer at the time, and it was eventually published in the West. So, while life in East Berlin was one of deprivations and shortages, West Berlin symbolized the Golden West, with plenty of goods and services readily available and comparable to any other world-class capital, even though it was surrounded by a wall of division. My protagonist also gains perspective of life in the West when he decides to stay longer and sublets a furnished apartment. Time out. The flat came equipped with a Siemens big-screen color television and remote. Many nights switching channels, I began to see a pattern in some of the prime-time viewing being regularly offered. 1 or 2 evenings a week, they televised back-to-back documentaries filmed during Europe's post-war era depicting the hardships that befell the nation and its neighbors after losing an ill-advised war. Other programs showed how Berliners and Germans in general were pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and rebuilding from the rubble, or cheerfully enjoying glasses of schnapps and American-made cigarettes with their friendly and magnanimous captors. This programming was so consistent, I started referring to the evenings of the telecasts as German Guilt Night. A 4th station, beaming over the wall from East Berlin, was picked up in the West. OCTV carried some of the most saccharine, low-budget people's programming imaginable. hiking and garden shows, folk music jamborees, local athletic events, dry, arcane talk shows, and signed off the air well before midnight. After making friends in West Berlin, my narrator becomes no stranger to the city's legendary bar culture. Here he catches up with Hans-Peter and some new acquaintances in Kurel, a trendy cocktail lounge noted for its postmodern decor and potent cocktails, best described as the C and B scene locale of the moment. The bar's name pays tribute to Werner Rainer Fassbinder's final film based on French novelist Jean Genet's mariner fantasy about randy sailors. There was something just quietly cool about the place. To my taste, the chrome-trimmed furnishing, shiny Formica tabletops, and fluorescent tube lighting gave it the ambience of an airport boarding lounge. The servers, aloof and flip, deigned to take orders in between bantering with mates at the bar and flirting with customers. Though the West Berlin scene was rather insular, the mating rituals of gay men are universal. Kurel was a frequent staging area Hans-Peter used to launch assaults on the city's club scene. For a night of serious drinking and cruising, the strategy honed locally was to hit 3 or 4 bars, sometimes more, if still standing. Over the first round at Kurel, they caught up with everybody's latest news. Well, moving right along, said Jasper, lowering his voice and leaning in conspiratorially, I heard the juiciest bit of gossip today at the office. Oh, what could a bunch of lawyers be gossiping about that could possibly interest any of us? Hans-Peter grumbled dismissively. You'd be surprised, Jasper said, and took a dramatic pause. Then, in his best newscaster impersonation, World News Flash! Germany's beloved chancellor has a paramour, a secret mistress. Well, I guess it's not a secret anymore, Egan chortled. Oh, poor Hannah-Laura, you think she knows? Ralph fretted. Well, we know, and we're not even in bond, Jasper noted pointedly. But here's the fun part. They say she, the mistress, was once a he. Et tu helmet, cracked Egon. Big laugh all around. You're kidding, I said, almost ready to believe it. Can that be true? Jasper scrutinized me with icy blue eyes. You armies are such doubters. All right. The mistress, yes. The sex change, I made that up. But you never know. It's amazing how from rumor comes truth. Perhaps one of the most dramatic and political upheavals was the fall of the Berlin Wall and how, like dominoes, the East Bloc regimes toppled, leading to the Soviet Union's collapse and reclaiming Russia as the country's name. The effect of the wall opening in Germany was dramatic. Consumer revolt. Seemingly overnight, the Berlin Wall opened. It had once been unimaginable that the wall would breach in such a dramatic and inspirational way. Then again, it was inevitable. It just was not possible to keep a vital and disciplined populace under wraps. That the GDR survived as long as it did had a lot to do with its Soviet oppressors' iron fist than it did with the East German people's political commitment. In the weeks leading up to the wall's fall, public protests escalated in the East. Very rare in East Germany because the government usually nipped it in the bud with brutal retaliation. Demonstrations of the 1950s were savagely set down, and with many dead and wounded. However, not all dissent was wiped out. The surviving East German churches were a force of contention. Religious observance was not encouraged by the state, but they looked the other way. Among believers and non-believers alike, mounting discontent was exposed in raucous church hall meetings. Soon, large protest marches brazenly challenged state authority. speaking out for equitable rights spread to other cities, Leipzig, Dresden, Halle, Karl-Marx-Stadt. Ironically, Heiko had chosen the right route, but his timing was off. After weeks of a standoff that turned the grounds of Western embassies in Budapest into makeshift refugee camps, Hungary stopped controlling its border, letting East Germans travel into Austria and other points west. Within weeks, burgeoning demonstrations and pressure from Bonn and the Allies forced the hand of the socialist regime. In a desperate move to preserve whatever civility was left in the GDR, the order was given to open the wall. Egon Kranz, successor to longtime party leader Erich Honecker, could not fight the tide of history. For the first time, millions of East Germans were free to visit the fabled West without applying for transit visas and humiliating waits, sometimes something few were eligible for anyway. Now they could simply walk or ride across the border at will, an early indication of reunification to come and the closing chapter in one Cold War saga. While the opening of the wall was dramatic, the daily invasion of West Germany by newly minted consumers was worse. Practically overnight, East Germans flooded the streets of West German cities and villages, especially those in closest proximity to the old border crossings. The Bonn government smoothed the transition to a consumer economy by offering Begrüßungsgeld, or welcome money, to every man, woman, and child with DDR identification. Now, with a few West marks in their pockets, there was less temptation to do something foolish. Like an earlier invasion by the Huns, East Germany evacuated daily, as covetous hordes of shoppers fell rapaciously on West Germany's cornucopia of goods and services. Department stores, appliance dealers, car showrooms inundated with would-be consumers, mostly looking at wares that they long fantasized owning. Now, it was only a matter of time before they could possess them. It speaks volumes about how shortages and material deprivations suffered under the socialist regime degenerated into a comedian's punchline: they came, they shopped. The contagion soon spread throughout the East Bloc, precipitating the eventual end of communist rule in the eastern part of Europe. Heiko's flight to the West is initially a bust, and his fake documents detected. He never made it out of Prague. Is returned to East Berlin and put in detention. But as luck would have it, there was a barter agreement where West Germany would pay the East Germans hard currency in exchange for political dissidents. The program was Heiko's get-out-of-jail-free card. Heiko Heinz's journey from oppressive East Germany to the Golden West in many ways is a metaphor that parallels the fate of his divided homeland and the so-called Wende, or changeover, that ultimately led to German reunification and resuscitation of the German identity. In the West, Heiko is blessed with unimaginable good fortune, yet it leaves him feeling empty. A lifelong inner struggle with gender identity threatens to overwhelm him. The unconditional acceptance of people in his life, in particular the scion of African royalty, finally gives him the courage to make the changeover, his own personal Wende. In an email to the book's narrator, Heiko opens up. You probably never saw this coming. You are asking yourself, how was it possible to have known me those many years ago and to know nothing of what teems inside me? The tormented soul trying to escape, yet thwarted at every turn. I played my part beautifully. I had the guy thing down perfectly, and my masculinity never questioned. Who else got around on a flimsy motorcycle in sub-zero weather? It was taking risks that kept me balanced. There was a certain thrill in courting danger, entering the belly of the beast and going unscathed. I needed to have so many things going on, so many distractions. Otherwise, I would have gone nuts. For as long as I can remember, I dreaded any kind of downtime. I had to be on the go, staying busy. No time to dwell on things you don't want to dwell on. I recognized that early on, time was running out for me in the East. If something in my life did not change dramatically, I wasn't going to be able to handle it anymore. I was entering uncharted waters, and though it took a lot of crap to get out of the East, I made it. I made it in more ways than one. Once free of the GDR nightmare, I experienced a rebirth of sorts. Natural talents I took for granted blossomed, and in the West, those gifts turned into hard currency. It takes more than talent. It's all about making connections, and I'm good at making connections. People are drawn to me. In a few years, I went from shampoo assistant to one of the hottest video stylists on the continent. When focused, I'm a tornado of creativity, sweeping along all in my wake. I make things happen, and it becomes seismic, spontaneous. Then I discovered it was the journey and not the destination that sustained me. With one well-received job after another, done with little or no effort, monotony set in. How could it get me better? I took a snort of this or popped a pill of that, and drink is always a reliable standby. I was at the top of my game, but on an emotional low point. My nerves were fraying. I put myself on automatic pilot. I found myself back where I started, struggling to make sense of my life, to make sense of the woman determined to cut herself out of me, more determined than ever to take control. I was going into a tailspin. Then the call to work in London came. The years I spent living and working in Berlin as a freelance journalist and party promoter were extremely valuable to the development of my craft as a writer. My sense of curiosity and the advantages of my profession gave me a unique access to understanding a nation that had undergone many ups and downs in the 20th century, yet a folk or people excuse me, that remained resilient even during the darkest of time of all, division. Finding late author Christopher Isherwood's quote long after completing my manuscript for this book was an unexpected endorsement. He recognized the great literary potential of post-war Germany's political climate and expressed the hope that another expatriate writer would come to love the city as he had before the war. I would like to think that Goodbye Heiko, Goodbye Berlin might have pleased him. My novel frames reimagined glimpses back, a record of a time and place that now only memory and imagination can conjure. It was the end of the Cold War era in Europe, and I was lucky enough to be both participant and witness. Myth and legend drew me to Berlin. It turned into an experience that enriched my life. Ik heb nog einen Koffer in Berlin. A popular saying suggested once you visit Berlin, you leave a part of yourself behind and will be returning. And I shall. Thank you for joining me this evening. I wish to thank Councillor Wagner and her staff for this generous invitation to read from my novel in her salon, New York, Berlin.
Very much. That gave a good insight into parts of the book. Thank you so much. Maybe some people got curious to read it later on. Are there any questions or comments? Anything you would like to know? Yeah.
Having grown up in the East myself, I just wondered whether you had any encounters with East Germans, like pre-fall of the war, that would somewhat make the perception of East Berlin, your protagonist, more complicated a little bit, because East Berlin was pretty much like West Berlin, an island. Mm-hmm. The cultural scene, despite its great buildings and trophies that you mentioned, was actually fairly
well, you have to read the book.
Wondered, whether you yourself as a writer encountered that.
Oh yeah. I mean I've only read you very small excerpts, right. But it's. No, I went to all the big parties where people like Krista Wolf were, and I really got to know the scene. I went to the famous happening at the at that famous theater that's across from, Babylon, Kino Babylon. They used to do these alternative happenings, and I was lucky enough to go to one of the last ones where people were actually speaking out against how unhappy they were in the East. So, in fact, I recreate that in the book that night at the Cinema Babylon. I do, I think, give people a glimpse of East Germany as well as West Berlin in that period. So I think if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see that it's a much more thorough picture of life in the East.
So how is Heiko doing today?
Heiko, I can't tell you because then I would end the story. I can't tell you. You have to find out.
It's a rather interesting turn.
Yes, it takes some rather interesting turns. You'll have to find out. But I want to say that people think this is autobiographical. Haiku was a combination of people and imagination. And a lot of German friends have said to me, "Oh, I know Haiku." So I feel, that I captured sort of a German Wunderkind at a period, because including my book, he goes on to be very successful in the West, and which happened to a lot of people who managed to escape before the wall came down. I've often wondered whether the incentive to get out of the East is what propelled them to succeed so well in the West, when after the Wende, so many people could go to the West, but they weren't so, people after that weren't so successful really. There weren't really a lot of standouts who hadn't, come prior to the opening wall.
There was one piece of what you read that baffled me a little bit. You said before the fence came down in Hungary that people had fled to the embassy in Budapest.
Yeah, they were. The Budapest. They let them. Not the Budapest embassy, but the German embassy.
The German embassy in Budapest.
Yes.
That was also
Yes. They were in Prague and they were in Budapest.
Well, I
And then Moscow.
But they were in Budapest too.
Yeah, because I met a lot of guys who. No, this was that's the summer of '89. But I had met people when I first got to Berlin who had gone that route prior to that. I even met people who had come in boats, who'd rowed over the waterways and got into West Germany. I mean, there's a lot of ways of coming. And in fact, the guy who gave me my German lessons, he came in a false bottom of a Volkswagen bus that he was under the front seat. So, and one of my first I went to the Volkshochschule in Berlin to further my German after Goethe Institute and Berlitz. Then I decided, well, let's go. And actually, most of the students were Turkish, which was interesting. And they were such sweet people. The Turkish the workers. They were the sons and daughters of the workers that came in the '60s, and so I really got. I basically lived there for almost 10 years, so I basically got the day-to-day life in East and West. And there was someone else, yeah.
How close were you able to get to families like Heiko's families in Vienna?
Yeah. I was invited. I spent my first Sylvester and Weihnachten, Christmas in East Berlin, for instance. And I'll never forget how fast that goose went. Boom!
The one you brought.
No, the other Western one. I think I brought.
Okay.
I think I brought the desserts. Yeah. But before I even got a taste, actually, it was gone.
I'm 88 years old, so my memory fits. I read this book with absolute admiration. And it captured a moment in my life that I never discussed or wrote about. I visited Berlin as a representative of the American Center for Camp with that international outfit. We were in West Berlin. It was almost like a story too overcast. Heinrich Böll had recently won the Nobel Prize, and he embraced us and told everybody everything. And Roger Strauss, who I was going, had told me to speak to Crystal, who wanted about